The fluorescent lights in the women's restroom buzzed with a grating, tired persistence, a sound that perfectly mirrored the ragged edge of my own profound exhaustion. I leaned against the chipped tile wall, feeling the cold seep through the thin fabric of my dress, and stared hard at the reflection in the mirror. I studied the shadows, the deep, purplish circles under my eyes that had become permanent fixtures, proof of too many sleepless nights, which no amount of expensive concealer could fully mask anymore. The rigid tension was etched around the corners of my mouth, a habitual strain. I noted the way my shoulders seemed permanently hunched forward, not in deference, but as if bracing continuously against some invisible, relentless wind. 32 years old, and the accumulated stress of the past year had weathered me into looking closer to 50. My hands instinctively reached out and gripped the cool, flawless porcelain edge of the sink, clinging to the physical reality as I fought to collect the scattered fragments of my composure. The divorce from David had been formally finalized 3 months ago, but the emotional and financial weight of it still pressed down on my chest like a physical slab of concrete. David had methodically taken the house, successfully seized the majority of our shared savings, and, perhaps most painfully, shattered my intrinsic belief that I could trust my own judgment. What he had generously left me with was a crushing mountain of legal fees that I was still desperately chipping away at. A cramped, perpetually drafty 2-bedroom apartment tucked away in a marginal neighborhood I had once sworn I'd never step foot in, and Clara. Always Clara. The constant, protective thought of Clara, my brilliant, precious daughter, waiting patiently for me at our tiny, discreet table near the smoky back exit of the bar, was the only thing that allowed me to straighten my weary spine. Whatever else I had lost, whatever catastrophic mistakes I had made in trusting the utterly wrong man, I had gotten one thing absolutely and profoundly right. Clara was sharp, intensely observant, inherently funny, and deeply, naturally kind. Everything I had salvaged from the wreckage of the last year, every sliver of goodness and hope, radiated from that beautiful 6-year-old girl, currently equipped with her faded rainbow braids and her cherished, slightly grubby unicorn backpack. I had been forced to bring her here tonight because Mrs. Chen, our sweet, elderly neighbor who usually watched Clara on the rare evenings I needed to meet clients, had suddenly called in sick with the flu. A high-end cocktail bar was hardly my first choice for a child-friendly environment. But Marco Calabresi, the owner, was an old friend from law school, and he had assured me that the early evening crowd was absolutely tame. Mostly tedious business meetings and hushed, quiet conversations over aged whiskey. He had given us a prime corner table, safely distanced from the main bar action, and Clara had been happily content with her array of coloring books and a juice box while I tried to review dense commercial contracts on my laptop. The Calabresi family had been deeply entrenched fixtures in this specific district for generations. Everyone knew Marco's father had connections, though people were always scrupulously careful never to specify exactly what kind of connections they meant. The bar itself possessed an old-world, intimidating elegance. All dark, highly polished wood paneling, deep leather booths, and soft, strategically placed lighting that made everyone look subtly more prosperous and powerful than they likely were in reality. It was definitively the kind of place where major deals were silently ratified with a firm handshake, and where questions regarding the precise nature of certain businesses were considered the height of poor manners. I dried my hands meticulously on the plush, thick towel provided near the sink, noting absently that even the complimentary bathroom amenities here were several grades nicer than anything currently residing in my apartment. The thought triggered a tightening in my chest, a familiar, painful mixture of searing shame and bitter resentment. I had worked myself ragged, done everything right by the book. Law school, passing the bar on my first punishing attempt, building a small but respectable practice dedicated to helping small businesses navigate Byzantine contracts and compliance issues. And yet, somehow, I had still ended up in this humiliating situation, scrambling to pay basic rent, taking critical client meetings in the shadows of bars because the proper office space was now an unreachable luxury. The restroom door swung inward and a woman entered, encased in a dress that screamed a 5-figure price tag. She gave me a single, fleeting, entirely uninterested glance before disappearing into a stall. I took that as my definitive cue to leave, quickly smoothing down my own dress, A simple navy sheath that I'd bought on sale 3 years ago and had worn to literally every single professional meeting since. Is professional enough, I fiercely told myself. It would have to be. As I walked back through the dim, cedar-paneled corridor toward the main room, I could hear the low, sustained murmur of important conversations, the delicate clink of expensive glassware, and the occasional, sharp burst of laughter that somehow sounded more strategic than genuinely amused. This was where power intersected with commerce, where fortunes were forged, and futures were decided over expensive scotch and exquisitely careful words. I emerged into the main room and immediately locked my gaze onto our corner table, a habit so deeply ingrained that the search was entirely subconscious. Clara should have been there, her blonde head bent low over her coloring book, entirely absorbed in the monumental task of staying inside the lines, exhibiting that intense, total concentration she brought to everything she did. The table was empty. My heart executed that familiar, dreadful lurch, a cold, sickening drop, the moment my eyes registered the empty leather booth. I scanned the bar area, the nearby tables, the entrance doorway. Nothing. The coloring books were still scattered across the polished dark wood, their pages splayed open, Clara's half-finished juice box sweating next to them. A perfect tableau of temporary abandonment. But my daughter was nowhere in sight. "Clara?" I called out, trying desperately to keep the rising tide of sheer panic from cracking my voice as I moved quickly toward the table. "Clara, where are you?" A few heads turned in my direction, registering mild, fleeting curiosity, but no one seemed particularly concerned about a mother calling for a missing child. I was just starting to pivot, my panic escalating exponentially with each passing, silent second, when I saw them, in a discreet, semi-private alcove near the deep back wall of the bar, separated from the main room by a semi-transparent partition of frosted, custom glass. A scene was unfolding that made absolutely no logical sense to my terrified mother brain. Clara, my sweet, shy, usually flawlessly obedient 6-year-old daughter, was standing right beside a heavy table occupied by 3 massive men in bespoke suits. Her small hand was bravely tugging on the sleeve of the one whose broad back was facing me, a back that suggested custom tailoring could barely contain the man's bulk, a clear indicator of countless hours spent on physical training. I hurried toward them, my sensible heels clicking far too loudly against the expensive hardwood floor, drawing far more unwelcome attention than I desired. As I got closer, I could clearly hear Clara's voice, possessing that peculiar, endearing mixture of childish innocence and the surprising, premature wisdom that she had somehow developed despite her young age. "You should check it again, sir," she was saying earnestly, her small face serious and utterly focused. "My mommy always says you have to read things twice, or someone might try to trick you." The man she was addressing had gone completely still. The other 2 men at the table looked utterly shocked, frozen in place as if they had just witnessed something fundamentally impossible. And then the man Clara was talking to slowly, almost deliberately, turned his head, and I got my first clear, paralyzing look at his face. Adriano Moretti. I knew who he was. Everyone in this city knew who he was, even if they strategically pretended not to. The local newspapers were careful about what they printed, conservatively labeling him a prominent businessman or a major real estate developer. But the truth was an open secret, whispered only in the right, hushed circles. Adriano Moretti controlled half the Italian district, and his influence radiated far beyond legitimate business ventures. He was palpably dangerous, breathtakingly powerful, and absolutely not someone whose focused business meeting should be interrupted by a small, unsolicited 6-year-old girl. He was also, I registered with a detached, clinical sort of observation, devastatingly handsome in a way that seemed almost unfair. Dark, immaculate hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from cold marble, all severe, sharp angles and intense, Mediterranean features. Even sitting down, he radiated a kind of controlled, lethal power that made the air surrounding him feel noticeably charged. The heavy, complicated watch on his wrist probably cost more than my entire car, and the tailored charcoal suit he wore moved with his body like a perfectly integrated second skin. His eyes, when they finally lifted and met mine over Clara's blonde head, were a striking storm gray and utterly unreadable. For a moment, nobody moved. I stood there, my mouth dry, my heart hammering a desperate rhythm against my ribs, struggling to formulate words that would somehow apologize profusely for my daughter's intrusion without inadvertently making the situation catastrophically worse. Then Adriano Moretti did something completely unexpected. He looked down at Clara, not with the expected irritation or raw anger I had been bracing for, but with something that looked almost like intense curiosity. "Your mother taught you to read contracts twice?" he asked, his voice surprisingly deep and gentle. Clara nodded, enthusiastically bouncing on the balls of her feet. "She says the important stuff is sometimes hiding in the middle where people think you won't look very hard." A muscle twitched once, sharply, in his jaw. He glanced down at the document spread across the table in front of him. A thick, multi-page contract, some pages already bearing official-looking signatures. Then he looked back at Clara, and something subtle in his expression shifted, settling into razor focus. "I'm so sorry," I finally managed to say, my voice coming out higher and thinner than normal. "Clara, sweetie, you absolutely can't just interrupt people's meetings. Come here, please." But Adriano held up one hand, a gesture that was simultaneously polite and utterly commanding, the kind of subtle movement that strongly suggested he was very accustomed to immediate, unquestioning obedience. "One moment," he said, not taking his eyes off the contract. He began flipping through the pages, not scanning, but devouring the text with a terrifying, instantaneous focus, his finger tracing line after line of dense text. The other two men at the table exchanged glances, their shocked expressions slowly hardening into something that might have been acute nervousness. The silence stretched on, becoming thick and weighted, broken only by the crisp rustle of pages turning. I desperately wanted to grab Clara and flee, to get as far away from this entire situation as possible. But something kept me utterly frozen in place. Maybe it was the intensity of Adriano's focus, the way his entire demeanor had instantly changed from relaxed composure to something razor-sharp. Maybe it was the growing, palpable tension emanating from the two other men. Then Adriano stopped abruptly on a page located about two-thirds of the way through the document. His eyes narrowed dangerously. He read something, read it again, and when he finally looked up at the two men seated across from him, his face had gone absolutely cold and devoid of all expression. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice now carrying an edge that made my skin prickle sharply with a premonition of warning. "I think we need to discuss paragraph 17, subsection B. That's the part where you've very cleverly hidden a clause that would transfer operational control of the Atlantic shipping routes to your organization within 18 months. The color drained instantly from both men's faces. "Adriano, we can explain." One of them started stammering. "Get out." The words were quiet, a dangerous undertone to a simple command, but they carried absolute, devastating authority. "Get out of my city. If I see either of you again, you won't walk away." They left quickly, scrambling to gather their papers with visibly shaking hands, not even attempting to offer further apologies or arguments. Within 30 seconds, they were completely gone, and Adriano Moretti was looking directly at me and my daughter. "Thank you," he said to Clara, his voice returning to that surprising gentleness. "You may have just saved me from making a very expensive mistake." Clara beamed up at him, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just prevented what I strongly suspected might have been the opening move in a territorial war. "You're welcome. Mommy says we should always help people when we can." His eyes shifted to mine, and I felt the full, heavy weight of his attention like a physical burden. "Your mother is clearly a very wise woman," he stated. "I'd like to speak with her, if that's possible. Privately." It was not a request, despite the polished, polite phrasing, and as Clara slipped her small hand into mine, looking up at me with complete, unconditional trust, I realized with chilling certainty that our lives had just taken a sharp, unavoidable turn into territory I had never, ever imagined navigating. 3 days after Clara had accidentally saved a Mafia boss from signing away a significant portion of his territory, I sat in the impossibly quiet, luxurious reception area of what the building directory carefully labeled Moretti Enterprises. trying very hard not to descend into a full-blown panic attack. The office occupied the entire top floor of a monolithic building in the financial district, and every single detail about it screamed old money, absolute power, and ruthless efficiency. The receptionist, a poised woman named Angela with flawless makeup and an even more perfect Italian accent, had offered me espresso in a tiny, delicate cup that likely cost more than my entire kitchen dish set. I'd accepted the offering because my trembling hands desperately needed something to hold, even though they were shaking far too much to actually manage drinking anything. "Mr. Moretti will see you now, Miss Salinas," Angela said smoothly, her voice friendly but strictly professional, gesturing toward the imposing double doors at the end of the long hall. I stood up on legs that felt distinctly unsteady, smoothing down the same simple navy dress I'd worn to the bar. It was still my best and only professional option, though this time I'd paired it with my one good blazer, attempting to look more capable lawyer and less desperate single mother fighting foreclosure. Not that I thought I was fooling anyone in this building. The walk down that silent hallway felt infinitely longer than the actual distance. Original artwork, pieces that I suspected were worth more than my yearly income, lined the walls. The custom carpet under my feet was so extravagantly thick it nearly silenced my footsteps entirely. Everything about this place was meticulously designed to remind every visitor of exactly how much unassailable power resided here. The double doors opened into an office that looked like something pulled directly from a high-end architectural magazine spread. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the entire city laid out below. The desk was massive, clearly an antique of tremendous value, positioned perfectly to catch the natural light. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with weighty, leather-bound volumes in both English and what I assumed was Italian. And behind that desk, rising slowly from his chair as I entered, was Adriano Moretti. He looked different in the unforgiving clarity of daylight, I immediately noticed. Still dangerous, still powerfully imposing, but somehow more human without the dramatic lighting of the bar concealing him. He had traded the tailored jacket for his shirt sleeves rolled precisely to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle, hinting that he managed his own security, both physical and corporate. A thin, subtle gold chain caught the high noon light at his throat, a discreet but unmistakable marker of wealth that never needed to shout. "Miss Salinas," he greeted me, his deep voice carrying well, gesturing to one of the soft leather chairs positioned across from his desk. "Thank you for coming. Did I have a choice?" The words came out before I could possibly stop them, my anxiety manifesting as uncharacteristic, shaky boldness. A flicker of genuine amusement crossed his severe face. "Actually, yes. I don't make a habit of forcing attorneys to take meetings with me. It tends to complicate the attorney-client relationship." I sat down slowly, deliberately processing that statement. "I'm not your attorney." "Not yet," he agreed, settling back into his own chair. "But I'd like you to be." The sheer absurdity of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Adriano Moretti, a man who undoubtedly had a dozen high-powered international law firms vying for his business, wanted to hire me. Helena Salinas, whose office was currently her cramped kitchen table, and whose biggest client last month had been a dry cleaner dealing with a minor lease dispute. "Mr. Moretti." "Adriano," he interrupted gently, but firmly. "If we're going to work together, we should be on a first-name basis." "We're not going to work together," I stated, trying to infuse my voice with far more firmness than I actually felt. "I appreciate that Clara helped you the other night, but I am not the right person for whatever you need. I'm sure you have lawyers. Good ones. Who missed what your 6-year-old daughter caught in 30 seconds. He finished, his expression hardening slightly. "Yes, I do have lawyers. Expensive ones. Ones who should have reviewed that contract with the thoroughness I pay them for." His expression darkened. "They didn't. Your daughter did. She was just repeating something I told her." I protested weakly. "It wasn't. She saved me from losing control of a significant portion of my shipping operations," Adriano said bluntly, cutting me off. "The clause those gentlemen hid in that contract would have transferred operational authority gradually, so subtly that by the time I noticed, it would have been too late to challenge it without starting a war." A war that would have cost lives, Miss Salinas. Not just money. Lives. The chilling, undeniable weight of his words settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I'd known Clara had interrupted something important, but I hadn't fully processed just how important until this precise moment. I need someone who actually reads, Adriano continued, leaning forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Not someone who schemes and assumes they know what's there. Not someone whose loyalty might be compromised by connections to my competitors. Someone who approaches every single document like it might contain a deadly trap. He paused, letting the statement hang in the opulent air. Someone like you. You don't know anything about me? I pointed out, though my internal resistance was weakening rapidly, and we both knew it. The prospect of steady work, of a paycheck that might actually cover the rent and Clara's needs with something left over, was seductive in a way that made me furious at my own vulnerability. I know more than you think, he said calmly. After the incident at the bar, I had you researched. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but in my position, caution is not a luxury. It's necessary. My hands tightened painfully on the leather arms of the chair. Researched. You graduated third in your class from Columbia Law, he said, as if reciting from a meticulously detailed document he'd memorized. Passed the bar on your first attempt with scores in the 97th percentile. Spent 5 years at Hendricks & Associates, where you specialized in contract law and corporate compliance. You left to start your own practice 3 years ago. He paused, allowing the details to sink in. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago. Your ex-husband was also an attorney, which explains why you're now running your practice out of your cramped apartment and taking meetings in establishments like Marco's instead of maintaining the professional office space you held previously. The casual, dispassionate way he laid out my recent professional failures and personal humiliations made my face burn with intense shame. That's quite thorough. I'm not judging, he said, and something in his tone made me look up at him sharply. Your ex-husband had family money and deep connections. He used both against you in the divorce proceedings. That's not a reflection of your abilities, Miss Salinas. It's a reflection of his character. The unexpected, gentle sympathy in his words was somehow more unsettling than the blatant invasion of my privacy. I didn't want this dangerous, powerful man to be understanding. It would have been far easier if he had simply been threatening or aggressively demanding. What exactly would this job entail? I asked, and hearing myself ask the question was like listening to a stranger speak. Review and analysis of all contracts before I sign them, Adriano said immediately, without hesitation. You would have full, non-negotiable authority to refuse any agreement you deemed unfavorable or excessively risky. You would also work actively on legitimizing certain aspects of my business operations, transitioning them to fully legal frameworks where possible. The careful phrasing wasn't lost on me. And the aspects that can't be legitimized? You would never be asked to participate in anything illegal, he said firmly, meeting my eyes. That is non-negotiable. Your job would be to keep me and my organization on the right side of the law wherever possible, and to protect us legally when we're operating in the gray areas. There's a significant difference between gray areas and illegal activity, I reminded him. Yes, he agreed. And I need someone who understands that difference profoundly, and who isn't afraid to look me in the eye and tell me when I'm crossing the line. He leaned back, resting his weight against the chair's leather. I'm offering you a position as my legal counsel, full-time, a salary of $250,000 a year to start, with performance bonuses, full benefits, including health insurance that would cover both you and Clara, a proper office here in this building, and the understanding that your priority would always be keeping me and my people out of legal trouble, not helping us get into it. The number echoed in the sudden silence of my head, so large it didn't seem real, almost fictional. That was more than I'd made in the best year of my entire career. More than I'd even realistically imagined making for at least another decade. With that kind of money, Clara could attend excellent private schools. We could move to a secure, respectable apartment. I could stop lying awake at 3 a.m. doing agonizing mental math that never quite worked out. What's the catch? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, certain there had to be a fundamental one. Adriano's expression remained profoundly serious. The catch is that you would be working for someone whose business interests occasionally conflict with the letter of the law. The catch is that some of my associates are not people you would ever choose to socialize with. The catch is that this world," he gestured vaguely at the opulent office around us, "is not always a safe one. You're saying I could be in danger." "I'm saying I would ensure you weren't," he corrected, his voice hardening slightly. "You and Clara would both be under my protection." He briefly cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "That's not negotiable either. Anyone who threatened or harmed either of you would be dealt with immediately and decisively." The way he said "dealt with" made it horrifyingly clear he didn't mean through lengthy legal channels. And somehow that was what finally made this entire situation feel real. This wasn't just a job offer. This was an explicit, irreversible invitation into a completely different world. One where the rules I'd spent my whole life learning didn't always apply, and where protection came at the highest price. "I need time to think about it," I said finally. Adriano nodded, as if he had perfectly anticipated this request. "So of course, take a week. Talk to Clara's school. Look at the office space I'm offering you. Consider what this would mean for your future." He stood, moving around the desk to hand me a sleek, heavy business card. "This is my private number. When you've made your decision, call me directly." I took the card, the metallic weight of it feeling immense in my palm. The card in my palm felt heavier than any paper should, weighted perhaps by the consequence it represented. I stood, intending to walk away and bury the entire proposition, but his voice, low and resonant, stopped me mid-turn. "Miss Salinas Helena," he said, and the use of my first name, stripped of any professional title, was a deliberate, sharp hook that made me pause, my hand resting on the doorknob. "I'm not asking you to compromise your principles. I'm asking you to help me live up to higher ones." Think about that. The audacity of the statement. Asking a woman to lend her integrity to his shadow world left me breathless. I left his office moments later, my head spinning with moral debate, the business card feeling like a brand searing a hole through the fabric of my purse. A decision was looming, heavy and inescapable. One I knew would not just shift my life, but utterly redefine it. The inevitable came 5 nights later. I called him at 2 o'clock in the morning, the hour of total surrender, when exhaustion and fear finally intersected. Sleep had been impossible ever since Mrs. Chen, bless her quiet, fierce heart, had tapped on my apartment door that evening. With her voice barely above a whisper, she informed me that our landlord was planning a brutal rent increase. A shocking 40% hike. She'd overheard him bragging to another tenant and had rushed to warn me before the official, cold notice arrived. The desperate kindness etched into her weathered, familiar face had made a lump form in my throat, threatening tears I refused to shed. Adriano answered on the second ring, instant and alert, as if he hadn't been asleep at all. "Helena," he said, his voice a low thrum against the late-night silence. "How did you know it was me?" I asked the stupid question automatically, then realized its absolute futility. Of course, he knew. He was a man who measured risks and calculated moves. He likely had my number programmed into his secure contacts the minute his card left his hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked, completely bypassing my question. "I want to see the office," I declared, the exhaustion making my tone brittle. "The one you mentioned. Before I make a final decision, I need to see it now." A subtle flicker of amusement, devoid of any genuine mockery, touched his voice. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all. I'll send a car for you in 20 minutes. I should have pushed back. Should have insisted tomorrow would be a more reasonable time. But a desperate, primal need within me demanded visibility and action. I needed to witness the truth of the opportunity, whatever it might be, in the dark hours when deceit felt harder to maintain. "I'll be ready." The car that arrived promptly was a marvel of dark engineering. Sleek, utterly black, and utterly silent. The driver, a watchful man named Marco, spoke only a single syllable to confirm my name before we slipped into the deserted city streets. At this pre-dawn hour, the metropolis was an entirely different entity. Emptied of the daytime rush, stripped bare of its endless pretense, somehow feeling more honest in its silent, concrete existence. We pulled up to the same imposing building I had visited days prior, but now the surrounding streets were hushed and still, the windows of the neighboring structures uniformly dark. Adriano met me in the cavernous lobby. Tonight, he was dressed down, betraying none of the tailored formality of his earlier persona. Dark, perfectly fitted jeans, and a black cashmere sweater that certainly cost more than the entirety of my meager professional wardrobe. His hair was slightly disheveled, as though he'd recently run a hand through the dark strands, and I noticed with a sharp intake of breath that he looked startlingly more approachable, more human, and far less like the polished, untouchable villain from a high-stakes crime drama. "Thank you for coming," he said simply, his gray eyes steady, before he gestured me toward the private elevator reserved exclusively for the top echelon. We ascended in a silence punctuated only by the smooth mechanism of the lift, the numbers climbing steadily toward the penthouse level. When the doors whispered open, he led me not toward his familiar opulent office suite, but down a short corridor to a different set of rooms I had never glimpsed. He inserted a key card, opened the door, and flipped on the lights. I stepped across the threshold into what I could only describe as the physical manifestation of professional aspiration. It was smaller than his intimidating main office, yet still generously spacious, dominated by wall-to-wall windows that offered a magnificent, sweeping view of the dark river and the skeletal skyline beyond. The desk was massive, carved from solid, dark wood, already equipped with a sleek laptop and a communications console. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one entire wall, currently bare but waiting patiently to be filled with legal texts and case files. There was a small, intimate conference table, a deeply comfortable-looking leather couch, and then, in the corner, a sight that made my composure utterly falter. It was a child-sized desk and chair, painted a brilliant white, the sides delicately decorated with tiny, hand-painted flowers. A straw basket overflowing with high-quality art supplies sat beside it, alongside a neat stack of coloring books and children's literature. "For when Clara needs to be here," Adriano explained quietly, his gaze fixed on my reaction. "Angela's daughter is about the same age. She helped me choose the furniture." I walked slowly toward the small desk, my fingers trailing across the smooth, cool surface. I recognized the books immediately. They were all titles Clara cherished, dog-eared fairy tales, bold adventure stories, and picture books focused on brave, uncompromising girls. Someone, perhaps Angela, perhaps Adriano himself, had paid meticulous attention to small, insignificant details that, in this moment, suddenly mattered more than any $1 million salary. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, keeping my back to him, unwilling to let him witness the fragility of my self-control. "Really? The salary, the customized office, all of this. You could hire anyone. Anyone established, anyone with a clean resume. But I don't trust anyone," he countered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Trust is earned, Helena. It's not something that can be bought or demanded. And your daughter, without even knowing what she was doing, earned my trust in 30 seconds. That tells me everything I need to know about how you raised her, about your judgment, and ultimately about your character." I finally turned to face him. He had moved, now leaning against the door frame, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his gray eyes blazing with intensity. "I did research, too," I admitted, crossing my arms defensively. "After you offered me the job, I talked to people who know about your businesses, about your reputation." "And what did you learn?" he asked, his expression unreadable. I couldn't discern if he was genuinely curious or profoundly concerned by what I might have discovered. "That you're dangerous," I stated honestly, without flinching. "That you control territory and influence that extends far beyond your legal businesses. That people who cross you tend to disappear." I paused, gathering my resolve. "But I also learned that you keep your word. That you protect the people who work for you with ferocious loyalty. That you have rules you don't break, and one of them is absolute. Women and children are never acceptable targets." A profound, sorrowful shadow flickered deep in his eyes at that last part. "My mother," he said quietly, the words rough-edged. "She was caught in a crossfire between my father's organization and a rival family when I was 12 years old. She survived, but only barely. I was there, I saw what it cost her, what it cost all of us. His jaw tightened, a muscle clenching visibly. I made a promise that day that no one under my protection would ever experience that kind of random, targeted violence. I've kept that promise for 20 years. The raw, almost painful honesty in his voice surprised me. This wasn't the impeccably controlled, powerful man from the bar, nor the shrewd, calculating businessman from the mahogany desk. This was someone profoundly shaped by past trauma, a man who had built his own rigid set of rules around gaping emotional wounds. If I take this job, I stated slowly, my own conditions now laid bare, I'm going to be difficult. I'm going to question everything. I'm going to tell you no when I think something is too risky or crosses ethical lines I'm not comfortable with. I'm counting on it, he replied instantly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I need someone who will be difficult. Someone who isn't afraid of me. I am afraid of you, I corrected sharply. But I'm more afraid of not being able to take care of my daughter. More afraid of the rent increasing again while my savings dwindle away to nothing. More afraid of Clara growing up watching me fail over and over again. Adriano pushed himself off the door frame, closing the short distance between us until he was standing close enough that I could clearly see the tiny, beautiful gold flecks scattered throughout his storm-gray eyes. You're not a failure, Helena. You are a mother doing everything humanly possible for her child in a system designed specifically to make that as difficult as possible. His voice softened, lowering to an earnest plea. Let me help. Not because you owe me anything, but because you deserve the same security and protection I offer everyone who works for me. I can't be owned. I warned him, needing that boundary clear and immovable from the outset. I won't be controlled or manipulated. If I stay, it's because I choose to, every single day. I wouldn't want you any other way, he assured me, extending his hand across the space separating us. So, do we have a deal, counselor? I looked at his hand, strong, faintly scarred, a lifeline extended in the dead of night that I had never anticipated needing, let alone accepting. Behind him, through the immense window, the city was finally yielding to the first, tentative hints of dawn, a faint light beginning to creep across the distant skyline. A new day, a new, utterly terrifying beginning. I took his hand. We have a deal. His grip was firm, surprisingly warm, and lasted a measurable moment longer than strictly professional courtesy required. Welcome to Moretti Enterprises, counselor. I think you're going to change everything around here. As it turned out, his prediction was immediately and profoundly correct. My first official day commenced not with organization, but with utter chaos, which I would quickly realize was the standard operating procedure for Adriano's world. Clara and I arrived at precisely 8 a.m. I had enrolled her in an after-school program that included morning care, but Wednesdays were always closed, and Mrs. Chun had a long-scheduled doctor's appointment. Adriano had insisted I bring Clara whenever necessary, so I did, expecting perhaps a quiet orientation to my office and a stack of initial documents to review. Instead, I walked into what could only be described as meticulously controlled pandemonium. Adriano's main conference room was packed, stuffed shoulder to shoulder with men in expensive, high-quality suits, all talking over one another in a rapid-fire mixture of English and pressurized Italian. Voices were undeniably raised, though they stopped just short of outright shouting. The tension hanging in the air was palpable, thick enough, one might say, to choke on. Angela intercepted me instantly in the marble hallway, her expression a mixture of relief and urgency. Thank God you're here. Adriano's been asking for you every 10 minutes for the past hour. I wasn't supposed to start until 8, I pointed out, feeling defensive and slightly overwhelmed before I'd even managed to sip my coffee. Crisis doesn't follow a schedule, Helena, she replied kindly, placing a warm hand on my arm. She looked down at Clara, instantly adjusting her tone. Hello, sweetheart. Would you like to help me with some very, very important filing while your mother is busy in the big meeting? It requires expert alphabetization. Clara looked up at me, her small face uncertain. I hesitated. She was my daughter, my sole responsibility, and I barely knew these powerful, high-stakes people. But Angela's smile was warm and genuine, and I caught sight of a framed photograph on her desk. a laughing young girl about Clara's age. Is that okay, baby? I asked Clara softly. I'll just be down the hall. Clara, who was exhibiting more bravery than I felt, nodded resolutely. I can help file. I'm very good at alphabetizing. I bet you are, Angela said warmly, taking Clara's hand and leading her away. Come on. I'll show you my daughter's desk. She's at school right now, but I think she wouldn't mind sharing her supplies for a little while. As they walked away, I took a deep, steadying breath and turned toward the noisy conference room, my stomach churning violently with immediate anxiety. This was it, my first real high-pressure test. I straightened my shoulders, checked that my conservative blazer was perfectly buttoned, and walked in. The rapid, furious conversation died the exact moment I appeared in the doorway. Every single head in the room swiveled toward me, and I felt the collective, assessing weight of multiple critical gazes. These were men thoroughly accustomed to wielding power, accustomed to total control, and accustomed to women existing only in very specific, often decorative roles in their world. A junior legal counsel with full authority was definitely not one of those roles. Gentlemen, Adriano announced from the head of the immense mahogany table, his voice cutting through the awkward, deafening silence with effortless, chilling authority. This is Helena Salinas, my new legal counsel. She has full authority to review, approve, or reject any agreements we enter into. Her judgment on legal matters supersedes all others in this room, including mine. The declaration was so baldly stated and so absolute that several men's eyebrows shot up in unison. One of them, a silver-haired man who exuded the effortless confidence of old, generational money, leaned back imperiously in his chair. No disrespect, Adriano, but we are in the middle of a time-sensitive negotiation with Doluqua. Perhaps Miss Salinas could familiarize herself with the situation, and we could reconvene in a few hours. Helena stays, Adriano interrupted, his tone firm and final. Catch her up, S. The man who'd spoken, presumably S., sighed sharply but offered a reluctant nod. We're finalizing a partnership agreement with the Doluqua organization out of New Orleans. They want access to utilize our Northeastern distribution network in exchange for granting us exclusive rights to their Gulf Coast ports. The deal, ostensibly, is worth roughly $8 million annually to both sides. Let me see the contract, I said immediately, moving to take an empty chair near the center of the table. Someone immediately slid a thick, heavy document across the polished wood toward me. I opened it and instantly understood the source of the frantic arguing. The contract was a structural, legal disaster. Pages and pages of dense, convoluted legal language that seemed deliberately designed to obfuscate, rather than clarify the actual terms. Red flags, bright and alarming, jumped out at me within the first few scanned pages. This is unacceptable, I stated flatly after scanning through the initial section. The room went silent again, heavier this time. S's face darkened, his jaw tightening. Excuse me? Page 3, paragraph 7, I said, not bothering to look up from the document. The liability clause is structured so that any legal complications arising from operational difficulties, and I'm using their quotation marks here, would fall entirely and solely on Moretti Enterprises. Operational difficulties is deliberately vague language that could encompass anything from simple shipping delays to complex federal investigations. I flipped several pages forward with practice speed. Page 9 creates a binding arbitration clause that mandates all disputes be resolved by an arbitrator mutually agreed upon by both parties. But page 15 specifies, in tiny print, that said arbitrator must be licensed to practice law in Louisiana, which functionally creates an unassailable home court advantage for Doluqua. I paused one last time, turning to the final critical section. And page 21. I looked up now, meeting the eyes of the silent, waiting men around the table. Page 21 includes a non-compete clause that would prevent Moretti Enterprises from engaging in similar business arrangements with any other Gulf Coast organizations for a period of 10 years. I let the number sink in. 10 years of being locked out of an entire, growing economic region because of vague liability language and a hidden arbitration clause. Adriano leaned forward, his expression intent, his focus laser-sharp. I thought the non-compete was 5 years. It was in the draft they sent last week, one of the other men confirmed, agitated. They must have changed it in the final submission. They did, I confirmed, my voice firm, along with about 15 other minor modifications, all of which exclusively favor Duluqua. This isn't a partnership agreement, gentlemen. It's a carefully crafted trap dressed up as a lucrative opportunity. S looked ready to physically explode from frustration. We've been negotiating this deal for 6 months. The Duluqua family has significant influence in the South. Walking away now could create severe bad blood. Signing this contract would create worse than bad blood, I countered, maintaining eye contact. It would give them the leverage to essentially control your southern expansion for the next decade while making you financially and legally liable for any and all of their operational problems. The room erupted again, a fractured cacophony of voices. Some men agreeing instantly with my assessment, others insisting loudly that the organization couldn't afford to alienate potential powerful allies. I remained quietly seated, waiting for the noise to subside, my gaze fixed on Adriano. He was watching me, I realized, not with annoyance or frustration, but with something that looked strikingly close to deep satisfaction. When the arguing reached a desperate fever pitch, he simply raised one hand, palm up, just an inch above the tabletop. An immediate, total, heavy silence followed. The casual display of absolute, unassailable power was genuinely startling. Helena, he said calmly, what would you recommend we do? Reject it entirely and start over, I said instantly, without needing a second to consider. Draft a new contract from scratch, using clear, specific language and equal, transparent liability distribution. If Duluqua refuses to renegotiate on those terms, walk away immediately. There are other ports, other partnerships. This particular one isn't worth signing away your organization's future flexibility. For a long, critical moment, Adriano simply regarded me. Then he nodded once, decisively. Draft the new contract. S. Inform Duluqua that we are withdrawing our signature pending a complete, fundamental revision of terms. If they object to the premise of equal liability, tell them they can take their business elsewhere entirely. The finality and authority in his voice made it unequivocally clear that the discussion had ended. Men began gathering their heavy papers, some looking visibly relieved by the averted disaster, others still deeply frustrated by the lost time. S approached me after most had departed, leaning in close. You just cost us 6 months of diplomatic negotiation, he murmured, not quite accusatory, but certainly not friendly either. I saved you from 10 years of legal regret, I replied simply, meeting his gaze. There's a considerable difference between those two outcomes. His stern, aristocratic expression cracked just slightly, a hint of grudging respect emerging. I suppose we'll see if that's true. He extended his hand, a formality I respected. Welcome to the madhouse, counselor. After the large conference room finally cleared, Adriano found me waiting in the hallway, still processing the velocity of the morning. Coffee? He offered. Please, I managed, realizing I had been running on pure adrenaline and sheer terror since stepping out of his black car hours earlier. His office, when we returned, was a sanctuary. Quieter, perfectly contained, a contrast to the morning's chaos. He poured us both coffee from an expensive, state-of-the-art machine in the corner, handed me a thick porcelain mug, and gestured toward the comfortable armchairs near the window. You handled that remarkably well, he observed, settling opposite me. Most people wouldn't have the stomach or the courage to call out a fundamental contract flaw in front of that many senior, stubborn members of my organization. Most people aren't being paid $250,000 to tell you the truth, I replied, sipping the rich, dark liquid. If you wanted someone who would just nod and agree, you hired the profoundly wrong person. He smiled then, a genuine, unforced expression that completely transformed his usually serious, guarded face. I hired exactly the right person. His phone buzzed discreetly, and he glanced at the screen, his expression instantly shifting back to the controlled focus of the CEO. I need to take this call. Take your time with the coffee. Angela will show you to your office when you're ready to settle in. After he left, closing the heavy door silently behind him, I sat in the luxurious armchair by the window, savoring the coffee that was richer and smoother than anything I had ever tasted, looking out at the waking city that no longer felt quite as daunting or overwhelming as it had only a week ago. A soft knock interrupted my contemplation. Clara stood tentatively in the doorway, holding a stack of neatly organized papers pressed against her chest. "Mommy, I finished the alphabetizing. Angela said I did really good." I set down my cup and held out my arms. She ran to me, and I pulled her into a tight, familiar hug, breathing in the comforting scent of her strawberry shampoo and the faint smell of printer paper. "I'm so incredibly proud of you, baby. Is this your new office?" she asked, looking around Adriano's imposing space with wide, curious eyes. "No, this is Mr. Moretti's office. Mine is down the hall. Can I see it?" I glanced at my watch. I had nearly an hour before Clara needed to be dropped off at school. "Let's go look." My office was exactly as I remembered it from my clandestine midnight visit, except now it was full day, flooded with crisp natural light. Clara made an instant beeline for the small, flower-painted desk in the corner, sitting in the child-sized chair and spinning around once with pure delight. "This is for me?" she asked, touching the basket of art supplies reverently, as if they were fragile treasures. "For when you need to be here with me," I confirmed. "For days like today when you don't have school care." She immediately opened one of the thick coloring books, and I watched her settle into the focused, determined concentration she brought to everything she did. After a moment, she looked up at me again, her expression serious. "Mommy, are you happy here?" The unexpected, direct question caught me completely off guard. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," I admitted honestly, "but I think maybe I could be." "I like Mr. Moretti," Clara announced, immediately returning to the detailed coloring of a brave knight. "He has kind eyes." I thought about Adriano's eyes. Storm gray, intense, deep, capable of reflecting both sudden tenderness and absolute, terrifying coldness. "They're complicated eyes," I said carefully, trying to explain the shades of a man 6-year-olds shouldn't have to understand. "Nope," Clara countered with the simple, unwavering confidence of childhood. "They're kind. I can tell." Maybe she could. Perhaps 6-year-olds possessed a clarity of vision that adults, who had learned over years to expect the worst from complicated people, had long forgotten. Or maybe my daughter was just hopelessly optimistic in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. Either way, as I watched her focused coloring and listened to the faint, muffled sounds of the office coming to life beyond my door, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. 3 months into my demanding employment at Moretti Enterprises, I realized I had completely underestimated how consuming this professional world would become. The hours were routinely long, though Adriano never explicitly demanded that I stay late. It was the crushing nature of the work itself. Every contract I reviewed seemed to contain several hidden traps, buried clauses, or deliberately vague threats. Every agreement revealed treacherous layers of complexity that required painstaking analysis and meticulous correction. I quickly found myself staying at the office until Clara's bedtime became negotiable, reviewing 100-page documents by the focused light of my desk lamp while she worked on her homework at her little white desk. Or, once finished, diligently taught me increasingly elaborate origami techniques. That last, surreal part had begun accidentally. Clara had been captivated by a library book about paper folding and decided she had to master the technique. Adriano had walked into my office one particularly late evening to find her painstakingly explaining how to make a perfect paper crane, her small fingers demonstrating the required folds with surprising dexterity. Instead of leaving, he had quietly pulled up a spare conference chair. "May I try?" he had asked Clara, his voice gentle and deferential in a way I had rarely heard it used with anyone else. She had beamed at him. "You have to be really careful with the corners, Mr. Moretti. That's the most important part." Now, 2 months later, my expansive office windowsill displayed an entire menagerie of intricate origami animals. Cranes, elephants, miniature boats. All collaborations created by Adriano and Clara during the evenings when unavoidable work kept me hours past quitting time. The sight of the feared head of an organized crime family sitting cross-legged on my office floor, his tongue caught between his teeth in deep, meticulous concentration as a 6-year-old meticulously instructed him on proper paper folding technique, never stopped being profoundly surreal. "Your elephant's trunk is crooked," Clara would tell him with stern seriousness, and he would accept the critique with more patience and grace than I had ever seen him afford anyone else, carefully unfolding and painstakingly refolding the paper until she finally offered her small, approving nod. The staff had definitely noticed. Angela whispered to me once that she had literally never seen Adriano like this. Patient, effortlessly playful, almost boyish in his focused determination to master whatever minute detail Clara taught him. The fierce, almost religious loyalty that his people already felt toward him seemed only to deepen as they witnessed this unexpected, gentle side of their leader, as if seeing him treat a child with such care confirmed something deeply reassuring about his true character. But it wasn't all delicate origami and slowly building trust. The professional work itself was revealing unsettling aspects of Adriano's vast, shadow-laced world that I wasn't entirely sure I was emotionally or ethically equipped to handle. Take the meeting I had walked into just last week. Tuesday. I remembered the day clearly because of the chilling effect the document had on me. Adriano had asked me to review a new consulting agreement involving someone named Dmitry Volkov. Initially, flipping through the pages, it appeared deceptively normal, just boilerplate language, standard terms for high-level business advisory services, the kind of polished legal fiction I now dealt with daily. But as I traced the flow of funds, I stopped cold. The entire structure felt rotten. The fees were paid not directly to Volkov, but filtered through a labyrinth of 4 separate shell companies, each registered in a different offshore jurisdiction, acting as deliberate, opaque intermediaries. It looked suspiciously and aggressively like textbook money laundering. I held onto the file until everyone else had cleared out, the vast office turning silent and echoing around us, before I finally confronted Adriano in his private quarters. "This isn't a consulting agreement," I'd said, the words cutting into the stillness as I slid the thick document across the expanse of his mahogany desk. "This is a sophisticated payment scheme designed specifically to obscure the origin and destination of substantial funds." He didn't flinch. He merely looked up at me, his gaze steady and assessing, radiating the sort of contained power that demanded absolute silence. "Dmitry operates businesses that exist firmly in gray areas," he explained, his tone measured. "The payment structure allows him to receive compensation in a way that doesn't trigger mandatory banking alerts or invite unwarranted regulatory scrutiny. It's money laundering, Adriano. Regardless of the semantics, the intent is clear. It's financial privacy," he corrected, leaning back slightly, testing my resolve. "Everything about it is technically legal. The shell companies are registered correctly, adhering to the letter of local laws in their respective territories. The payments are reported to the appropriate tax authorities. But yes, the structure is undeniably designed to make tracking the money, its source, its movement, extremely difficult for anyone outside of this office." I stood there, the familiar conflict churning violently in my stomach. The ethical line I walked every day had suddenly snapped taut, threatening to toss me off balance. "You promised I wouldn't be asked to participate in anything illegal. You made that condition sacred. And I'm keeping that promise," he said quietly, his voice losing its challenging edge and softening into something closer to reassurance. "This isn't illegal, Helena. It's just complicated, intentionally obtuse. But if you're uncomfortable with it, if your conscience objects, I won't sign it. That's precisely why you're here, to be my conscience when mine gets cloudy, when the edges of my world begin to blur." The fact that he had genuinely given me that power, that ultimate authority to refuse, to unilaterally veto a major contract with an important associate, surprised me more than his admission of the scheme. And ultimately, after another 2 excruciating hours spent deep diving into the case law and jurisdictional precedents surrounding the payment structure, confirming that while nefarious, it was not strictly prosecutable, I let it proceed, but only with aggressive modifications that tightened the language and made me marginally more comfortable. But the incident had served as a stark reminder. I was walking a tightrope stretched thin between legitimate business and something fundamentally darker, and the line separating them was far thinner, far more invisible, than I had ever dared to believe. Tonight was another of those late evenings that had become the rhythm of our lives. Clara had finished her homework and was now absorbed in the complex geometry of folding paper, her brow furrowed with intense, childlike focus. Adriano sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his concentration mirroring hers as he attempted to duplicate her intricate work. I should have been reviewing the complex corporate liability contract spread out before me, but instead, I found myself watching them, captivated by this unlikely portrait of quiet domesticity. Like this? Adriano asked, holding up a partially completed paper crane, his large hands looking almost clumsy against the delicate paper. Almost, she said, leaning over to gently adjust one of his folds with the precision of a master craftsman. You have to make sure both sides match exactly, or the wings won't look right when you pull them. Perfectionist, he teased gently, a slight smile touching his lips. Mommy says, if you're going to do something, do it right, Clara replied, completely serious, not missing a beat. Otherwise, what's the point of starting? His eyes flickered up to me briefly across the desk, catching my gaze in the soft ambient light of the late hour, and I saw something warm and surprisingly vulnerable in his expression. Your mother is very wise, he murmured. I felt an unnecessary heat rise instantly to my cheeks and deliberately forced my focus back to the contract, pretending to decipher a particularly dense clause. Over the past 3 months, something undeniable had shifted between Adriano and me. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, and it certainly wasn't purely professional anymore. There was a palpable comfort that had developed, an easy familiarity built from long, late nights in adjacent offices, from his unwavering patience with Clara, from the immediate, unquestioning way he had approved my request for time off to attend her school play, telling me without hesitation that family always came first, no exceptions. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something thoughtful, intense, and deeply probing, that made my pulse quicken unexpectedly before I forcefully reminded myself exactly who he was and what his world represented. Mommy, look! Clara held up a flawless, pristine paper crane, her small face glowing with pride in her accomplishment. Mr. Adriano made one all by himself. It's beautiful, I said honestly, watching as Adriano's serious, guarded expression softened into genuine, unreserved pleasure at her approval. For you, he said, offering it to Clara. Your collection on the windowsill is missing this specific shade of sapphire blue. She accepted it reverently, adding it with painstaking care to the growing display of origami creatures on the ledge. As she arranged the new addition, Adriano stood and moved quietly to where I sat at my desk, standing close enough for me to catch the faint scent of expensive cologne and midnight exhaustion. You should go home, he said quietly, his voice low. It's almost 8. Clara needs dinner and sleep, and frankly, so do you. I'm almost done with this contract review, I protested automatically, even though the dense legal language was beginning to blur before my tired eyes. It can wait until morning, he insisted, placing a gentle hand on the edge of the document, signaling the conversation was over. I'll have Marco bring the car around now. Over the months, I had finally stopped arguing about the mandatory car service. Initially, I'd protested vehemently that I was perfectly capable of taking the subway, as I always had. Adriano had explained patiently, his tone brooking no disagreement, that as his principal legal counsel, I was afforded certain protections, and one of them was not traveling on public transportation where I was exposed and vulnerable to unpredictable elements. The first time someone at the subway station had recognized me, calling out Moretti's lawyer, with a mixture of raw respect and weary suspicion, I had understood his cold, calculated point. Thank you, I said, gathering my things quickly. Clara, time to pack up now. She carefully placed her origami supplies back into their wicker basket, said good night to Adriano with a spontaneous hug that he returned with surprising, tender warmth, and took my hand. As we waited in the quiet hallway for the elevator to arrive, Clara yawned, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Can Mr. Adriano come to my recital next week? My heart stuttered a nervous rhythm in my chest. Asterisk baby, Mr. Adriano is very busy. I'm sure he, star. What recital? Adriano's voice came from directly behind us. He had silently followed us out into the hallway, standing a respectful distance away. My class is doing a show about the seasons, Clara explained, lighting up. I'm autumn. I get to wear orange and red and throw paper leaves all over the stage. That sounds wonderful, he said, immediately crouching down to her level, giving her his full, undivided attention. When is it? Thursday at 6 o'clock. I interjected quickly, desperate to mitigate the situation. But you really don't have to. It's just a school thing. I'll be there, he said, his eyes meeting mine as he stood. His statement a quiet, unwavering promise. If it's all right with your mother, of course. Clara looked up at me with those wide, pleading eyes, the ones I had never in my life been able to resist. Can he come, Mommy, please? How could I possibly explain to her that inviting him into this small, precious piece of our personal life felt profoundly dangerous? That I was already struggling desperately to maintain the necessary boundaries between the professional shield and the personal self? That watching him be so unexpectedly gentle and protective with my daughter was starting to make me feel things I had absolutely no business feeling for a man like him. Of course, he can come, I heard myself say, the words slipping out without permission. If he wants to, that is. I want to, Adriano confirmed, and the quiet certainty in his voice sent a sudden, unanticipated warmth expanding through my chest. The recital turned out to be surprisingly emotional. Clara was utterly adorable in her rust-colored autumn costume, throwing her handfuls of paper leaves with dramatic, theatrical flair. But what caught me completely off guard was looking over during the performance to find Adriano, seated 2 rows away, filming the entire thing diligently on his phone. There was a small, genuine smile on his face, and he was completely absorbed, mesmerized by watching my daughter pretend to be a falling leaf. After the short show, Clara ran immediately to us, throwing herself into my arms, vibrating with post-performance energy. Did you see me? Did you see? You were perfect, I assured her, kissing the top of her head. You were brilliant, Adriano agreed. A truly convincing autumn. She giggled, then looked between us with that unnerving, assessing gaze children sometimes deploy. Are you guys friends now? The question hung heavy and unexpected in the air between us. Adriano's eyes met mine, and I saw my own profound uncertainty reflected, magnified, in the depth of his gaze. Yes, he said finally, his voice calm and deliberate, cementing the statement into reality. I think we are. And somehow, impossibly, it was true. The insidious thing about building a life inside someone else's world is that you often don't notice how much of your old identity, your old sense of stability, you've shed until something forces you to confront the naked reality. For me, that moment arrived 5 months into my employment at Moretti Enterprises, on a Tuesday that started like any other and ended with the foundation beneath everything changing irrevocably. I was quietly reviewing a complex commercial lease agreement in my office, the air conditioning humming low. Clara was absorbed in her coloring at her small, adjacent desk, a picture of contented peace, when Angela's voice came through the intercom system with an unusual tight tension. Helena, you need to come to Adriano's office immediately. The raw urgency in her tone made my stomach instantly clench into a hard, cold knot. I looked at Clara, who hadn't looked up from her page. Stay here, baby. I'll be right back. She nodded vaguely, already focused on staying meticulously inside the lines of her drawing. I found Adriano standing by the vast, panoramic window, his posture rigid and impossibly straight. A specific stance I had quickly learned to recognize as barely contained, concentrated fury. 3 other men stood in his office. His hulking head of security, Marco. His cold, calculating second-in-command, and someone I didn't recognize. This last man was wearing an expensive, impeccably tailored suit and an expression that screamed calculated law enforcement presence. Helena, Adriano said without turning around, his voice flat. This is Detective Mark Rossi with the Organized Crime Task Force. He has some questions he'd like to ask you. My blood ran cold. A shocking, sudden drain of warmth. This was it. The exact moment I had half expected, half dreaded since I first took this job. The moment when my professional association with Adriano would finally cross a line I couldn't uncross, exposing me to the consequences of his shadow world. Ms. Salinas, Detective Rossi said, his tone professional, slick, but not exactly unfriendly, which made it worse. I understand you are the principal legal counsel for Moretti Enterprises. I am, I confirmed, forcing my voice out, making sure it remained absolutely steady, betraying none of the internal panic. Then you should know that we're conducting an ongoing investigation into potential racketeering activities. We have reason to believe that several contracts facilitated by this organization constitute money laundering and extortion. My lawyer brain, trained over years of crisis management, instinctively kicked in, suppressing the surge of raw, physical fear. Do you have a warrant, detective? He smiled, a humorless, tight pull of his lips that was far from pleasant. Not yet, but I will by end of day, pending review. I'm here now as a courtesy, Miss Salinas, to give Mr. Moretti the opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. How considerate, Adriano said, his voice dangerously soft, the tone suggesting a razor blade disguised in velvet. And what exactly does this cooperation entail? Full financial disclosure, Rossi replied, his eyes locked on mine. All contracts entered into within the past 6 months, details on business partners and affiliates, and testimony regarding the specific nature of your organization's activities. That's not going to happen, I said immediately, stepping forward to stand slightly ahead of Adriano, adopting my lawyer posture. Mr. Moretti is willing to provide documentation as required by law through proper, official legal channels. He will not submit to an interrogation without his attorney present, and any financial disclosures will be made only through official requests with appropriate, standard legal review time. Rossi's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed me, recognizing the sudden, solid wall of legal obstruction. Miss Salinas, are you aware that obstructing a federal investigation carries significant penalties, including potential disbarment? The threat was clear, cold, and calculated. Cooperate now or lose everything I had worked for. My license, my career, my ability to support Clara. I'm also aware, I replied, keeping my voice level despite the frantic, erratic rhythm of my racing heart, that you currently don't have the legal authority to demand anything without a judicial warrant, and that threatening an attorney for advising her client of his legal rights constitutes explicit intimidation and harassment. For a long, charged moment, nobody spoke. The silence in the opulent office was louder than any shouting. Then, Rossi reached slowly into his inner jacket, a movement that instantly made Adriano's security detail immediately tense and shift their weight, and withdrew a business card. When you're ready to discuss this reasonably, call me. You have until Friday to produce the requested documents voluntarily. After that, we'll do this the hard way. He left, flanked by his associates, but the crippling tension in the room didn't dissipate with his departure. Everyone out, Adriano said quietly, his voice still tightly controlled. Except Helena. When we were finally alone, he turned to face me fully. The cold fury I'd sensed earlier was still very much present, simmering just beneath the surface, but beneath it was something unexpected that looked distinctly like raw concern. Are you all right? I just got threatened with disbarment by a federal task force investigator, I said, my voice shakier than I'd meant it to be. So no, not really. He moved toward me, stopping close enough that I could see the tiny gold flecks dancing in the gray depths of his eyes. I won't let that happen. He cleared his throat, the sound a brief, rough interruption. You can't promise that, I said. If they have genuine evidence, if they build a case. They don't have anything, he interrupted firmly, his conviction absolute. Because you've made sure every contract I sign is legitimate, clean, and unimpeachable. You've been keeping me honest, Helena. That is exactly what I hired you for. If they choose to investigate, then they will only find a businessman conducting legal operations with thorough documentation and the counsel of a scrupulous attorney. You haven't done anything wrong. Neither have I. Not in any way they can prove in a courtroom. This is intimidation. Nothing more. I wanted desperately to believe him, but I'd also spent 5 months learning exactly how microscopically thin the line was between legal and illegal in his world. How easily transactions could be interpreted multiple ways depending entirely on who was looking and what agenda they carried. I have Clara to think about, I said quietly, the vulnerability stinging. If I lose my license, I lose everything. You won't, he insisted, the word a steel-plated vow. I promise you, Helena, you won't lose anything because of me. A soft, small voice from the doorway made us both turn sharply. Mommy? Clara stood there, her coloring book clutched tightly to her chest, her small face deeply worried. Are you okay? You sound upset. I immediately crossed the room to her, kneeling down quickly to her level. I'm fine, baby. Just some complicated work stuff, boring adult things. Is Mr. Adriano in trouble? She asked, looking past me to where he stood, radiating silent power. No, sweetheart, I assured her, pulling her close. Everything is going to be fine. But that night, after I tucked Clara into bed in the beautiful, much nicer apartment we'd moved into after I'd started working for Adriano, I couldn't shake the heavy fear that had settled cold and deep in my chest. I'd built a life here, a genuinely good life. Clara was thriving, happy at her new school. I was paying my bills with actual money left over for the first time in years. I'd even started to feel something akin to happiness again. A sense of lightness and security I hadn't experienced since before the crushing weight of the divorce. And all of it was built on the shaky foundation of working for a man whose business existed primarily in the shadows, whose protection came with a price I was only now beginning to fully understand. My phone rang, slicing through the apartment's silence. Adriano's name appeared on the screen. It's late, I said when I answered, my voice tired. I'm assuming this isn't about a contract review. I'm calling to tell you that tomorrow you're taking the day off, he said. You and Clara. Adriano, I can't just. You can and you will, he interrupted gently but firmly. You're stressed. You're worried. And you need time to clear your head. Marco will drive you and Clara wherever you want to go. Do something utterly normal. Something that has absolutely nothing to do with my world. The unexpected kindness in his voice made my throat suddenly tight with unshed tears. What about the documents Detective Rossi wants? I need to be here to compile the defense. I'll handle it, he said simply. That's not your problem to solve. It is if it affects my ability to practice law, I pointed out, my resistance fueled by self-preservation. Helena, he said, and there was something in the way he spoke my name. Not a boss, not a client, but something deeper, that made me pause instantly. Do you trust me? It was a loaded, impossible question. Did I trust him? The man who had thrown me a lifeline when I was drowning financially and emotionally, who had been patient and tender with my daughter, who had kept every single promise he had made to me, who was also undeniably involved in highly questionable, potentially criminal activities, regardless of how carefully we papered over them with flawless legal documentation. I admitted, the painful honesty catching in my throat. That's enough, he said softly, accepting the caveat. For now, that's enough. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, take Clara to the zoo or the museum or wherever she wants to go, and let me handle the detective. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark living room for a long time, thinking about trust and choices and the complicated, dangerous reality of building a life in someone else's volatile world. The next day, Clara and I went to the Museum of Natural History. We spent hours lost among the towering dinosaur bones, the dusty meteorites, and the detailed dioramas of ancient civilizations. It was exactly what I needed, a grounding reminder that there was a vast, timeless world beyond contracts and federal investigations, and the complicated, impossible feelings I'd developed for a man I had no business developing feelings for. Clara held my hand as we walked through the exhibits, her excitement infectious and bright. Mommy, did you know that some dinosaurs had feathers? Mrs. Martinez told us in science class. I did know that, I said, smiling genuinely at her enthusiasm. Pretty cool, right? Very cool, she agreed. Then, with the devastating directness that only children possess, she asked, Are you and Mr. Adriano going to get married? I nearly tripped over my own feet, startling myself back into the present crisis. What, Clara? Why would you ask that? She shrugged, watching a display of ancient Egyptian artifacts with profound fascination. You smile more when he's around. And he looks at you the way Prince Eric looks at Ariel in my movie. Asterisk out of the mouths of babes. Mr. Adriano and I work together, Sweetie. That's all. Okay, she said, clearly not believing me, but willing to let the immediate subject go. But if you did get married, would that mean he'd be my dad? The quiet, unmasked longing in her voice broke my heart into pieces. Clara had never known her biological father. My ex-husband had made it abundantly clear he never wanted children, cementing that stance through his complete and total absence in her life. She'd grown up with just me, and while I'd tried desperately to be enough, I knew she felt the profound absence of a father figure. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, I said carefully, trying to keep my tone light. Right now, Mr. Adriano is our friend and my boss. That's enough, isn't it? I guess, she said, sounding unconvinced. I just think he'd be a good dad. He's patient and he teaches me things and he always listens when I talk. Her words echoed in my mind, haunting me for the rest of the day. When we returned home that evening, I found a small package waiting outside our door. Inside was a note, folded precisely, in Adriano's distinctive, elegant handwriting. Asterisk, the investigation has been resolved. Your license and career are safe. Enjoy your day off. You've earned it. I called him immediately, the cold paper still in my hand. What did you do? I demanded. What I needed to do, he replied, his voice calm, steady, and utterly untroubled. The contracts stood up to scrutiny because you made sure they were clean. Detective Rossi was fishing, hoping to find something that wasn't there, and when his supervisors reviewed the voluminous documentation we provided, they concluded there was no basis for further investigation and withdrew their inquiry. Just like that? I asked skeptically. Just like that, he confirmed. Helena, I told you I wouldn't let anything happen to you or Clara. I meant it. Something in his voice, the quiet intensity, made my next words come out before I could stop them. Why? Why do you care so much? Silence stretched between us, thick and weighty. Because you're not just my lawyer, Helena, he finally said, his voice dropping slightly. You haven't been for a while now. My heart hammered rapidly against my ribs, reacting before my mind could process the implication. Adriano, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly, cutting off my protest. I just needed you to know. You and Clara, you've changed things for me. Made me remember that there's more to life than territories and contracts and relentlessly maintaining control. You've made me want to be better. I closed my eyes, Clara's words from the museum echoing perfectly in my mind. Asterisk, he looks at you the way Prince Eric looks at Ariel. This is complicated, I said finally, the only thing I could articulate. I know, he replied, and I'm not asking you to simplify it or make any decisions about what this is. I just wanted you to know that you're safe, that you're protected, that you matter to me. After we hung up, I stood in the dark living room for a long time, the package still in hand, feeling the immense weight of the choices I'd made and the profound choices I still needed to make. Clara appeared in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, ready for her final kiss goodnight. Is everything okay, Mommy? I pulled her into a tight hug, breathing in the familiar, sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. Yeah, baby, everything's okay. And for the first time in a very long time, I almost believed it. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, when I was staying late to finish reviewing a particularly complex merger agreement involving 3 continents, Adriano appeared in my office doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. Nervous, exposed, almost vulnerable. Clara had fallen deeply asleep at her small desk, curled up with her head pillowed sweetly on her arms. The late hour had finally caught up with her endless childhood energy. Can we talk? Adriano asked quietly, mindful of my sleeping daughter. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He sat, and for a long moment, he didn't speak, just studied Clara's sleeping form with something deeply tender and watchful in his expression. She asked me today if I knew how to braid hair, he said finally, a small, genuine smile playing at his lips, a flash of the unexpected warmth she often elicited. Angela's daughter taught her a new technique, and she wanted to practice on someone with short hair. Did you let her? I asked, already knowing the answer from the slight disarray of his usually perfect, controlled hairstyle. Of course, he replied. She's very determined, and surprisingly skilled for someone with such small hands. His expression grew serious again, the lightness dissipating instantly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Helena, I need to tell you something that can't wait. The profound nervousness in his voice was contagious, making my pulse quicken uncontrollably. Okay. Over the past 5 months, you've become essential to my work, yes. You are indispensable to my business. But you've also become essential to me personally. He paused, gathering his words with unusual care, as if each one were heavy with consequence. I've spent my entire adult life building walls, maintaining absolute control, never letting anyone get close enough to matter, close enough to see the man behind the operation. And then you walked into my world with your daughter and your unyielding principles and your refusal to be intimidated by me or by anything I represent. And somehow everything changed. I opened my mouth, ready to interject or question, but he held up a definitive hand. Let me finish, please. I nodded, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I'm not a good man, Helena. I've done things I'm not proud of. Made choices that can't be unmade or excused. My world is dangerous, profoundly dangerous, and being part of it means accepting risks that most normal people would run from without looking back. His gray eyes met mine with unreserved honesty, looking directly into my soul. Painful honesty, yet the words felt freeing, heavy with implication. But I want to be better for you, Helena, and for Clara. I want to be the man you both deserve, the safe harbor you haven't had. He paused, letting the weight of the confession settle. I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight, he continued, his voice softer now. I just needed you to finally understand how I feel, that this connection we have here. He swept a hand vaguely across the small distance separating us. The air electric. It stopped being strictly professional for me a long time ago. It hasn't been just business for months. I studied the planes of his face, taking in this formidable, dangerous man. A man whose reputation preceded him like thunder, yet who had, almost miraculously, displayed profound patience and unexpected tenderness with my daughter. He had done more than save my career. He had restored a core sense of worth, a security I had believed irrevocably lost. He wasn't just my employer. He was looking at me now not as an asset to be managed or controlled, but as something genuinely precious. I'm terrified, I finally admitted, the word a small exhalation. Terrified of what this seismic shift could mean, of the chaos that might ensue if I acknowledge, if I truly allow myself to feel, what's already blossoming inside me. I know, he murmured, his eyes full of understanding, not judgment. And I would never ask you to dismiss that fear. I'm only asking you to weigh it against the possibility that this life we could build, might be worth facing every single risk. Clara stirred just then, murmuring something soft about paper cranes in her sleep. We both looked down at her, and in that shared moment, a moment of quiet guardianship, something profound passed between Adriano and me. An undeniable understanding, a deep, protective affection, the nascent seed of what might one day mature into true love. She asked me today if you'd be at her spring concert next month. I stated quietly, watching his reaction. His sharp features immediately softened, his entire expression lighting up. Will I be there? He asked, hope evident in his voice. I took a deliberate, steadying breath, knowing this was the pivot point, the choice that would irrevocably alter our carefully constructed lives. Yes, I confirmed, but not just as my boss or even as a friend of the family. You will be there? I met his gaze directly, holding nothing back. As someone who matters to us, to both of us. The change in him was instantaneous. The genuinely unguarded smile that broke across his face transformed him, shedding years and the heavy armor he usually wore, leaving him looking younger, almost carefree. I would like that very much, Helena. More than you know. We settled into a silence that was no longer strained, but profoundly comfortable. A shared sanctuary. The city lights outside my office window twinkled, indifferent to the massive decisions being made within, while Clara slept soundly, an emblem of innocent peace nearby. The future stretched out before us now, a vast, complicated landscape, fraught with uncertainty, yes, but overwhelmingly filled with unexpected possibility. "Should we wake her now?" Adriano finally asked, glancing toward the sofa. "In a minute," I replied, reluctant to break the spell. "Let her have a little more rest." He nodded slowly, settling back into the deep leather of his chair, perfectly content to simply exist in the waiting. As I picked up the contract review again, the dry legal language seemed strangely beautiful. I found myself smiling, acutely aware of his powerful, steady presence. A feeling that was simultaneously startlingly new and profoundly familiar, like finally stepping onto the threshold of a home I hadn't known I had been searching for my entire life. Later, when it was finally time to rouse Clara, Adriano was the one who leaned in, gently shaking her shoulder until her eyes fluttered open. He helped her gather her scattered coloring supplies, crayons, markers, and half-drawn maps, and when she proved too heavy with sleep to walk, he effortlessly gathered her small, drowsy form into his arms, carrying her carefully to the elevator and down to the waiting car. I watched him carefully buckle her into the back seat, adjusting the belt just so, ensuring the strap didn't dig uncomfortably into her shoulder. In that precise, tender action, I thought about the profound quiet of earned trust, about the meaning of making deliberate choices, and the complicated, beautiful reality of building a shared life. Not just fitting meekly into someone else's world, but standing securely alongside them. "Thank you," I whispered, leaning in as he softly closed the passenger door. "For what?" he asked, tilting his head. "For being patient. For understanding. For caring about her so genuinely." He lifted his hand and touched my cheek briefly, a gesture so gentle, so unexpected in its tenderness, that it momentarily stole my breath. "She's easy to care about," he said simply. "So is her mother." The drive back to our apartment complex was quiet, suspended between the evening's confessions and the coming day. Clara dozed peacefully in the back seat, the light from the passing city streaming past the windows in long golden blurs. Adriano walked us all the way to our door, waited patiently while I navigated getting Clara settled into her bed, covering her with her favorite dinosaur blanket, and was still standing in the small foyer when I emerged from her bedroom. "I should go," he said, though his body language indicated he had no immediate intention of moving. "You should," I agreed, finding myself equally unable to retreat. We stood together in that cramped space, the air between us thick, charged with everything that had finally been spoken, and everything that was now just beginning. He leaned in slowly, deliberately giving me ample time to pull away, to retreat from the promise. He didn't kiss my lips, only brushed them softly against my forehead. A solemn promise, a respectful overture, not a demand. "Good night, Helena." "Good night, Adriano." After the sound of the elevator descending had faded, I stood for a long time with my back against the closed door, my hand pressed hard over my furiously racing heart. I thought about a bold 6-year-old girl who had dared to warn a notoriously dangerous man about checking his contracts, about how that single, ridiculous moment had set in motion a profound, irreversible chain of events that had somehow led me here, to me falling deeply, terrifyingly in love with a man I had never expected to even encounter, let alone implicitly trust with my fragile world. The next morning, I woke to the weak light of dawn filtering through the curtains and found a text message waiting. "Coffee? I'd like to discuss the Delqua counterproposal. Also, Clara's spring concert. Also us." I smiled down at my phone, the heaviness that had weighed on my chest for years lifting completely. My heart felt lighter, untethered. I typed back, "Yes to all three, especially the last one." And somewhere in that moment, poised between consuming fear and soaring hope, between the weary person I had been and the hopeful woman I was becoming, I finally made peace with the unexpected, magnificent truth. Sometimes salvation arrives from the most complex, unanticipated places, offered by the most unlikely of people, and all we can do is be brave enough to open our hands and accept it.